The Trump administration has reportedly proposed that Ukraine halves the size of its army, surrenders the Donbas region, and gives up some of its most powerful weapons, following secret talks in Miami between US and Russian negotiators. The meetings took place at the end of October, when the president's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, hosted Kirill Dmitriev, an advisor to President Putin, for 3 days in Florida. Witkoff then briefed Ukraine's national security advisor on the proposed peace plan earlier this week. So, to help us understand what this could mean, we're joined by Mark Galeotti, author and Russia analyst and founder of the consultancy firm Mayak Intelligence. Mark, hello.
Hi there.
Thanks for being with us. So, look, the US seems pretty clearly to be siding with Russia here. What's going on?
Well, look, let's start with some cautions. We've seen this in the past that we get these anonymous reports from White House insiders suggesting that there's going to be some kind of massive, frankly, capitulation to the Russian demands. And it turns out, frankly, to have been part of the infighting that takes place within the White House between, shall we say, the most pro-Ukrainian and this faction and those who I wouldn't say are pro-Russian, but just simply want the war to end. So, we have to have some caution. But if we are to accept this view, these perspectives, it does seem to be that Trump has finally decided he just wants to be rid of this war. He wants it off his desk. He wants the embarrassment of a war that he claimed he could solve so easily still rolling on. And to that end, they are basically willing to start really turning the screws on Kyiv. Whether or not Zelensky can actually agree to these sort of terms, though, that's a whole other issue.
Well, I mean, so look, assuming this is real, assuming this is something that the US both wants and is going to push Ukraine for, how bad are the stipulations here for Ukraine?
They are, I mean, the surrendering territory, which is part of it, surrendering this last little portion of Donetsk region, that would be a humiliation and a strategic reversal. But in some ways, haggling over the front line is kind of what we might expect. Arguably, even more serious, though, are the stipulations about cutting and limiting the size of Ukraine's armed forces and the kind of weapons it has at its disposal. Because it's one thing to actually accept an ugly peace, because at the moment there's no real evidence that Ukraine can actually force Russia into reverse and abandoning territories it's occupied. But at least the idea was that the remaining rump Ukraine could be made properly secure and sovereign, which will require security guarantees and which will require it to have substantial armed forces. Now, if those are limited as well, then essentially the rest of Ukraine will still be prey to further Russian aggression.
So look, Dmitriev, he said that the Kremlin feels heard over this. Would Russia be reassured that this kind of stuff is even being discussed, even if it doesn't go quite as far as the Americans, currently seem to be saying it will go?
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at the Russian press this morning and they're still being very cautious. But on the other hand, there's a lot of glee at the juxtaposition of this with the current corruption crisis, which is gripping the Ukrainian government and has come pretty close to Zelensky and maybe even his very powerful chief of staff, Yermak. So I think there is this sense that at the moment, between slow but nonetheless unavoidable reversals on the ground and increasing pressure at home, that there is that sense that essentially the Ukrainians are going to have to give something. Now, there's still ample room for haggling, but nonetheless, I think from the Russians' point of view, they have every reason to be really quite satisfied at the moment.
Their military position, the Russians, I mean, are they in a position where they're very strong and looking like they're going to get stronger and thus have a sort of a strong hand in negotiations? Or are they in trouble and really desperately keen to get out?
They are strong enough. I mean, and particularly remember, in some ways, it's not about what the real situation on the ground is, it's what Putin believes it. Look, at the moment, the Russians continue to advance slowly, but nonetheless fairly inexorably. They take massive casualties in the process, but they're still able, apparently, to recruit about 30,000 new soldiers every month, which pretty much replenishes any casualties. So at a time when the Ukrainians are having real trouble keeping their manpower up to strength, the Russians seem able. So it's not that the Russians are in some kind of dramatically challenging position. It's more that from Putin's point of view, he doesn't have to fight a war forever. He just has to be able to hold on longer than the Ukrainians can. And certainly the Russian calculation is that they can.
How does this link in with what's happening closer to home? Yesterday, John Healey, the defense secretary, revealed that a Russian spy ship is in British waters, we presume looking at cables and things like that, and it had also tried to blind RAF pilots with military-grade lasers. Is this sort of muscularity from Russia? I mean, does this tie in any way to the concessions they're trying to get out of Ukraine via Washington?
Yeah, very much. Look, the way they see it, the White House wants to get out of this war, but that it's the Europeans who are keeping the war going. That's the Russian perspective, because it's certainly true that with American aid dramatically reduced, essentially it's Europe that is having to bankroll Ukraine and its war. And therefore, we have seen this slow escalation of the so-called hybrid war, sort of sub-threshold grey zone. There's so many different terms for it. But, these sabotage and subversion operations in Europe that are really meant to not only distract and divide us, but also essentially say, look, if you continue to support Ukraine, we will make your lives more miserable. Yes, we're not going to do anything ridiculous like, launch military attacks or anything like that. There's no evidence that Putin plans that. But on the other hand, there is a lot he can do to kind of weaponize the inconvenience that he can cause the West. And I think that's really the point there. We're seeing a campaign just to try and tell the West, accept the inevitable, stop supporting Ukraine, or otherwise things get even tougher for you.
Finally, then, Mark, if you had to call it or just even give us a likelihood, should we see then what's just happened in Florida, this agreement, as being the beginning of the end, or is it just another sort of road bump along the way?
I think combined with the growing pressure on Zelensky's government, I think it might be the beginning of the end. But I absolutely think that at present, we're in a position in which Ukraine cannot and will not accept these terms. I could be wrong, but I think that we're seeing more likely that this is Trump's get out of jail free card. This is his chance to more or less wash his hands of the war and say, well, it's up to the Ukrainians and the Europeans to fight this now.
What we as Europeans have always supported is a long-lasting and just peace, and we welcome any efforts to achieve that. Of course, for any plan to work, it needs Ukrainians and Europeans on board. So this is very clear.
Discussions should start with a ceasefire on the contact line that allow for negotiation on the question of territories, on the question of security guarantees. We have said that, the US have said that, President Trump has said that, and Ukrainians are ready for this. The only obstacle to such the ordered discussions so far is Vladimir Putin.
Some kind of weapons attacks?
No, we have not been involved. I don't know what the involvement of Ukraine has been in this plan, but obviously for us it's important that whatever peace plan is on the table, that Ukraine is behind it. This is up to Ukraine. It's about Ukrainian territory. It's about Ukrainian sovereignty. So without a buy-in of Ukraine, you won't get the support of the Europeans.